Yes, I can.
Bona tarda. Benvinguts tots a aquesta nova sessió de les Converses de la Pedrera. El tema d'avui és un tema complex, com molts dels que es tracten en aquest escenari. Han passat més de 150 anys des que al petit hort d'una abadia de Borno, a Moldàvia, un discret monjo agustí que pràcticament no destacava en res i que portava una vida més aviat tranquil·la, va començar a fer encreuaments amb plantes de pèsols. I tants encreuaments va fer, i tan pacient va ser la seva investigació, que va esdevenir un dels treballs fonamentals de la genètica, de la moderna ciència genètica. Es deia Gregor Mendel i amb una gran paciència i meticulositat va poder establir els patrons de l'herència en els organismes vius. Amb aquesta descoberta es completava la teoria de l'evolució de Darwin i començava el seu camí una ciència realment revolucionària, la genètica. Des de llavors ha avançat tant que avui està en condicions no només d'explicar com es transmet l'herència, sinó de donar a la humanitat la capacitat d'intervenir sobre la seva pròpia genètica i sobre l'evolució mateixa. Del fascinant viatge de la genètica al llarg d'aquests 150 anys i dels dilemes que s'obren amb les darreres descobertes realment espectaculars, tracta justament el llibre El gen, una història íntima, un apassionat i rigorós relat del que ens ha portat fins aquí i de les inquietants perspectives d'intervenció sobre la identitat i sobre el destí de les persones que se'ns obre amb aquesta nova ciència. Un llibre fonamental que ens ha portat l'editorial Debate en castellà i l'editorial La Campana en català, per cert, amb una magnífica, extraordinària traducció del Xavier Pàmies. I avui tenim la sort de poder-ne parlar amb el seu autor, Siddhartha Mukherjee, del que vull destacar, abans de tot, la seva genial, extraordinària capacitat de fer comprensible, assequible i fàcil d'assimilar allò que, des de luego, no ho és. Els hi asseguro. Porto més de 20 anys, 30 gairebé, treballant en temes de biomedicina i salut i sempre he considerat que era una disciplina molt difícil, no només de comprendre, sinó encara més difícil d'explicar al gran públic. Per això penso que cal valorar molt la contribució enorme que ha fet a la divulgació científica, no només amb aquest llibre, sinó amb les seves dues obres anteriors, que també són un referent de la divulgació. Les lleis de la medicina és un d'elles, i l'emperador de totes les malalties, el càncer, pel qual va guanyar el Premi Pulitzer l'any 2001 de no ficció i també el Guardian First Book Award, que és un premi també molt important. Per tant, estem molt contents de tenir-lo aquí i de poder parlar d'aquest tema tan apassionant del que depèn no només la nostra vida, sinó probablement el futur dels nostres fills i de la humanitat. Siddhartha Mukherjee és oncòleg, és professor de medicina de la Universitat de Colúmbia, a Nova York, i és investigador també especialitzat en cèl·lules mare. Ha publicat treballs a revistes científiques com Nature, Cell, Neuron o New England Journal of Medicine, però ha pogut trobar, malgrat tot, i aquesta intensa activitat com a científic investigador, ha pogut trobar temps per donar obres de divulgació com aquesta. Són 750 pàgines, però no s'espantin, es devoren, igual que les millors obres de la literatura, perquè combina una genial barreja de les seves preocupacions personals, començant per algunes preocupacions de la seva família, que ha tingut casos d'esquizofrènia i de trastorn bipolar severs i que han portat el seu pare a preguntar-se per què això a la nostra família, fins a la història cronològicament explicada, però d'una manera molt entenedora, de com, pas a pas, des d'aquells pèsolets del Mendel, hem arribat avui a les noves tècniques d'edició genètica. Per tant, és un llibre necessari que s'haurà d'estudiar i s'haurà d'utilitzar a les facultats. Ell comença el llibre amb una cita del William Bateson, que és el científic que va acunyar el terme de genètica cap al 1900, que diu: Una determinació exacta de les lleis de l'herència produiria probablement, això és al principi del segle XX, més canvis en l'actitud de l'home respecte del món i del seu domini sobre la naturalesa que cap altre progrés que es pugui preveure en el coneixement científic. Vostè obre el llibre amb aquesta cita i acaba dient: la influència dels gens sobre les nostres vides i les nostres persones és més intensa, més marcada i més pertorbadora de com ens havíem imaginat. Aquest supòsit es torna encara més revolucionari i trasbalsador amb la capacitat que estem adquirint d'interpretar, modificar i manipular el genoma de forma dirigida, cosa que fa possible alterar futurs destins i futures capacitats d'elecció. Gairebé res, Amb el llibre Albedrío hem arribat. És així, realment? Ja sé que sí, perquè en el llibre ho demostra, però per la nostra audiència crec que és molt interessant que els expliqui succintament per què creu que és així.
It is an astonishing thing that in the span of about 150 years, we have moved from Mendel's original conception of the gene as something abstract, something he didn't even know what material it was made of, that could move the color of a pea, or the nature of a pea pod, or the way a pea vine was twisted. That idea, and in 150 years we are talking about genes being the mechanism by which our bodies acquire their form, by which we interpret the environment, by which functionally determine the fact that you and I have physiological selves. So it's a profoundly simple point, but the point is the following: that when you think about heredity, genes solve two problems at the same time. They solve the problem of how your parents can collapse information down to a single cell, thereby transmitting the information. That's problem number one. So in other words, how do you take information from two human beings and collapse it down so that another human being begins from a single cell? But the second problem is also just as interesting. The second problem is, how then does that cell become us? You see, these two problems, the problem of the transmission of information from one generation to the next, and also the problem of how that information then becomes manifest, how it springs to life in us, is both those problems have the same solution, and the solution is the gene. And so our bodies, our physiology, your physiology, my physiology, our brains, etc., are all ultimately made up through the bringing to life, to the springing to life of genes. Now, it's very important to realize that genes are not the only thing, of course, that determine your bodies. There's a majestic formula that people began to think about in the mid-20th century, which I can encapsulate, which is genes plus environment plus chance equals fate, equals human beings, equals features. So absolutely there's a role of the environment, absolutely there's a role of chance, but the gene is firmly in that formula. You cannot take it away. And manipulating genes, changing the genes, changes the formula. It's an astonishing thing that in 2017, 50 years ago, when we thought about this formula, we thought that genes were constant and the environment was the only thing we could change. 50 years later, we've switched. We're saying, maybe the environment, it's very hard to change. Why don't we just change the genes? That's an amazing idea, that in 50 years we've changed the weight of where manipulation happens. We've changed the weight because we've said, the environment, environment is, we've been trying to change them, and of course we've been persisting. But in the span of 50 years, we've said, maybe we should concentrate also on the other half of the formula and change the structure of human beings, the way we think, the way we behave, the way we are, by changing genetics. Before we go on, I really should try to tell you three things, which I think will set the background for the discussion. The three things, and we can talk more about the process of the book and the book itself, But three pieces of information I think are crucial. Three developments are crucial. In 2000, at the dawn of this century, which I call the century of the gene, in 2000, as many people know, we completed the draft of the human genome. What does that mean? That means that we scientists could figure out what the exact content is. The genome is written in 4 alphabets, yeah, A, C, T, G. Scientists could figure out what the content of that, of what sequence was in the human genome. So, Milagro, if I took your genome, if I sequenced your genome, it would have 3 billion something letters. And if I was to print it, it would be 70 full sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica. So this entire, if you walked in through that opening in this Gaudi building, all the walls of that atrium would be lined with just your genome, just one person's genome. So in 2000, that information was available. But of course, as you know, putting words on a page doesn't mean that you understand the meaning of the words. So between 2000 and 2017, we've started to understand meaning. What does this mean? What do these 3 billion letters mean? How is it that your 3 billion letters, which are only slightly different from my 3 billion letters, maybe by 3 or 4 sets of those encyclopedias, everything else is the same between us. How is that relatively modest difference make you versus me? One gene makes you female versus me a male. One gene, okay? That would be 1 page or 2 pages in that Encyclopedia Britannica. And look at the profound difference in anatomy and physiology between the two of us, yeah? But that's the product of one gene. It makes other things happen, but really one gene. Okay, so so between 2000 and 2017, we are undergoing a process that I describe in the book as reading. We are learning to read. We are learning to ascribe meaning to the human genome. For instance, the gene that determines female versus male, sexual physiology, we now know where that gene is. We now know what it looks like. We now know what the sequence is. We now know where it lives in the human genome, et cetera, right? So we are beginning to ascribe deep meaning to this genetic information. And then we're doing a second thing. The second thing is that, as you pointed out, we're also beginning to write information into the genome. In other words, 15, 20 years ago, if someone said to you, or to me as a scientist, if someone said, you know, this encyclopedia, 70 sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica, go to page 350 in volume 16, chapter number 4, and change one word into another word, I would say that's an impossible thing to do. I can't do it. There's no technology that exists. Technologies existed that were so cumbersome to use that were basically impossible to do this. In those 17 years, we have begun to create technologies that allow us to do precisely that. Leave the rest of the encyclopedia untouched and change that one word. And make it some other word. What if we change the one word which specified the gene for maleness versus femaleness? In fact, if you do that, we've done this experimentally in animals, the animal, if you just change that one word, 3 pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica, in this case, in a simple animal, the animal becomes completely female from a male. You cannot distinguish that female from any other female. It's physiology, it's anatomy, everything else is female. One word, 4 pages of that Encyclopedia Britannica. Some other person might wish to change that encyclopedia and erase a gene like Huntington's disease. If you have the mutation of the Huntington's disease gene, it is 100% certain that you will die of that disease during your lifetime. But if you change it, you can revert that back to normal. Breast cancer-related gene, BRCA, BRCA1, BRCA2, and so forth. So we are having this discussion, and this I think sets the background. We are having this discussion that in 150 years since Mendel described this abstract quality of something moving between peas, to a moment in which we're saying we're reading and writing this language. And the question that this book begins to ask is, what happens to a machine when the machine begins to write its own manual? So we are a machine that is beginning to write its own manual of instructions. We're reading it, we're understanding the meaning behind it, and now we're writing it. So that is I don't need to convince you, this is a momentous event in the history of the human species. It will make technologies, all other technologies, social media, Facebook, Uber, all of this stuff, it will make those seem like kindergarten. They will make them seem irrelevant.
El que passa és que és veritat que el gran canvi ha sigut a partir de 2012 amb la tècnica d'edició genètica del CRISPR, que ara sí que permet fer aquest tall net i polit a una pàgina per treure una frase i posar-ne una altra, per treure una paraula i posar-ne una altra. Però en la història, i en el llibre es veu molt clar, en la història de la genètica s'ha pecat d'optimisme moltes vegades. Quan encara no se sabia què era un gen, ja hi havia les experiències eugenèsiques dels Estats Units i d'Alemanya que pretenien fer selecció i millorament de l'espècie. Quan això encara no sabíem ni on era un gen ni com manipular-lo. En aquests moments, després també es va pensar, ara quan ja es va veure com eren els gens, on eren, com estaven organitzats, l'estructura de la doble hèlice, etc., es va dir, doncs ara ho tenim fàcil. Quan veiem que hi ha un gen que està mutat i que provoca una malaltia, canviem aquest gen i malaltia curada. Però això no ha sigut tan fàcil. Primer, ni tan sols en les malalties monogèniques en les que està alterada un sol gen ha sigut possible encara fer teràpies gèniques importants. Però, a més, el que s'ha vist després és que pocs gens o poques malalties podem explicar-les només per un gen. La major part dels processos, per exemple el càncer, tenen molts gens implicats. I una altra descoberta també molt interessant és que un cop que has identificat els gens i has averiguat, cosa que ha costat moltíssim i ha sigut un avenç extraordinari, quina funció concreta fa aquell gen, després resulta que aquest gen produeix unes proteïnes que al seu torn codifiquen altres gens que al seu torn, en la interrelació en els propis gens, generen noves funcions. Per tant, que el tema no està en un sol gen, sinó en la relació entre els gens, i això és molt més complicat d'intervenir. És a dir, no és tan senzill com treure una paraula i tornar-la a posar, no?
Well, you're making a very important point, and in fact I make this point very clearly in the book, which is that the aspiration to manipulate heredity the story of that aspiration is a parallel story to the scientific story of genetics. It's very important to remember it's a parallel story. In fact, it precedes, long before we knew the word gene, long before we knew the concept of the gene, long before we knew anything about genetics, human beings have been trying to manipulate heredity. Heredity is so fundamental to us, the concept of heredity. So Aristotle wrote about heredity, Plato wrote about heredity. If you read Plato's Republic, there are eugenic passages in Plato's Republic. Plato actually wants to create a eugenic republic. One of the things about if you read Plato's Republic carefully, one of the ways that Plato says that you might achieve an ideal political republic is by creating an ideal genetic republic. He didn't know the word gene, but he's using the idea of heredity, that people should breed correctly according to some formula. So you're absolutely right that the eugenic aspirations, the aspiration to change human heredity long predates the gene. When we understand that there is such a thing as a gene, there's such a thing as a genome, all of a sudden those aspirations can now work on something material. But the Nazis, just to give you a great example, Nazis knew really nothing about the chemical nature of the gene. And yet the aspiration to change the political state by manipulating heredity, by eliminating one race and substituting an Uber race, was ultimately based on some idea that human heredity, that a political state could be created by manipulating human genetic content. The second point that you're raising is also important and interesting, which is that you're absolutely correct that as we've moved along in an understanding of genes, we've realized that most human diseases are not the product of a single gene. Most human diseases and most human features, most human traits, your nose, the color of your eyes, the color of your hair, are not governed by single genes. That's absolutely correct. And in fact, you're also correct in saying that initial attempts to try to manipulate genetic information using gene therapy have run into troubles because of this exact reason. You try to change one thing, but it's a whole system. It's a big machine. You pull this one, it's like a Zynga block. You pull this one, and you hope that the whole building will stay intact with a missing block, but of course, the whole building collapses. But what's interesting about this is that it turns out that as we explore more and more about genetics, that remains true. This network idea, this idea that everything is interconnected remains true. But it also has turned out to be true that, and this is more frightening, it's also turned out to be true that you can actually make changes in certain very, very powerful nodes, and the network sort of readjusts itself to accommodate that change. I'll give you one very interesting example, and it requires some thinking, actually. Height, human height. So human height is the product, we now know, of many, many genes, not one gene, and many genes exerting small effects. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that it's also a product of the environment. If you take two identical twins, one is malnourished, the other one's not malnourished. Under conditions of malnourishment, you can only reach a certain height. When you give full nourishment, you get a different height. So great example of a typical human feature where there are many genes, there's a big variation, and the product of the environment. So all of this would be absolutely correct. And you could conclude from this, Milagros, that you will never be able to manipulate height in a predictable manner. That turns out to be true, but not completely true. It turns out that there are some genes, rare variants in the human genome, and they're rare, which have a disproportionate effect on height. So while your and my height is determined by many genes and environment, there are certain people in this world where just 2 or 3 changes in 2 or 3 gene variants will produce a disproportionate effect on height. So the conclusion from that would be, it's possible, might be possible, that if you just change those 2, you might get a disproportion, you might get 3, 4, 5, 6 inches, whereas changing most of the genes that govern human height that live in the middle, the variation, you're not going to get very much effect. Now, I don't know what will happen when you change those 2 genes that are the rare variants. Does the rest of the body just adjust? Is it like gender? If you switch one gene, you get a full flip. We don't know the answer. So Francis Collins, who was the head of the NIH, and I had a very public conversation. And Francis said, at the end of the conversation, sort of humorously, he said, what normal feature do you think will be the first to go into the rabbit hole of genetic manipulation? And I thought for a while, and I said height. I suspect that in societies where an enormous premium is placed on being tall, and where the eugenic aspirations are strong, I think there's a possibility that height will be one of the first to be manipulated.
El que passa és que després hi ha tota la variabilitat que la vida, en el llibre es diu molt clar, el genotip és allò que heredem i el fenotip és allò que hem heredat viscut, com ha interrelacionat amb el medi. I llavors, vostè és molt colpidor veure com en el començament del llibre parla, per exemple, de l'esquizofrènia que hi ha en la seva família i al final del llibre no tenim una resposta per l'esquizofrènia, com tampoc tenim una resposta, malgrat que s'ha buscat, vostè dedica un capítol sencer al gen de l'homosexualitat. Molt més difícil seria trobar els gens de la intel·ligència, que si això fos possible estic segura que la gent ho triaria abans que l'alçada, no creu?
Well, so there's a folkloric word, intelligence. So the folkloric word intelligence refers to some combination of the capacity to solve problems, problem solving, the capacity to have some talent, the capacity to have even have a a particular social fluidity. Okay? All of this is lumped into the folkloric word intelligence. Now, in the 1910s and 1920s, in fact, as part of the eugenic history, part of the history of the Nazis and other places, scientists began to take that folkloric word, intelligence, and began to create a concept or an idea that would capture the problem-solving capacity in a more codified way. And so that's the origin of the IQ test. This is just to remind people that historically, the IQ test arises from the folkloric use of the word intelligence, but it does not equal. This was a decision made by scientists to codify a certain kind of problem solving. In fact, it's not a bad idea. It's a relatively thoughtful way of thinking about problem solving. But I always remind people, you've got to think about history. You cannot confuse the word intelligence with IQ, because that is to deny what exactly happened. And that's why you need to read books like this. So what happens is that, in fact, as it turns out, and as you read in the book, is that quality, IQ, can that be inherited? And the answer is yes, it can be inherited. So, but we have to make an important distinction. And these are words. If you want to know about human genetic manipulation, you have to know the distinction between the following words. So, if you have two twins, identical twins, in fact, their IQs tend to be quite similar. So, in other words, if you have the same genetic code, you tend to have similar IQs on the order of, I'll give you some numbers, on the order of 0.6, 0.7. So fingerprints between twins are similar on the order of 0.9, 0.95. Yeah? Height is similar between twins on the order of 0.6, 0.5, something like that. IQ is on that 0.6, 0.5, 0.7 sort of area between twins, identical twins. Okay, but if you look from parents to children, this 0.6, 0.7 correlation drops dramatically. And that suggests that things like IQ have a genetic component. In other words, genes influence that problem-solving capacity. But there are many genes. Every time there's reproduction, genes get mixed around like a Russian roulette. And in fact, the capacity to transmit that whole thing to your child as a whole kind of box set is very, very low, because genes by their very nature get reassorted. Mendel discovered this. Genes by their very nature get reassorted. So you're asking a very, very important question. But in order to answer that question, we have to distinguish between things that have a genetic influence, IQ does, between things that can be transmitted directly from parents to their offspring. And the technical word that we use for this, it makes sense now if I say it, IQ is heritable, but not inheritable. You cannot inherit it from your parents, but it's heritable. Genes have a powerful influence on that. And the point here is that things that are not heritable, things that are not inheritable, things that you can't easily inherit from your parents, usually tend to be multiple gene, polygenic, and it's generally hard to control them. And so I think that even if we have some kind of desire to control that problem-solving ability in our children, if you want to call it IQ, it's not intelligence. Intelligence is a folkloric word. If you had that desire, it would be pretty tough. It would be pretty hard to do that, even if you wanted to. Long answer, but it's an important answer to an important question.
No, el que passa és que constantment en aquesta ciència hi ha la tentació de fer projecció sobre el que es podria fer, perquè realment la capacitat de manipulació seria extraordinària. Després, la realitat, el que va de la teràpia gènica a la realitat és moltes vegades molt més, diríem, molt menys ambiciós, en el sentit que cal anar pas a pas. I l'experiència de la pròpia teràpia gènica ens indica que cal ser molt prudent. Només en el camp de la teràpia, és a dir, amb la finalitat de curar una malaltia, el que hem vist és que agafar dreceres sense la seguretat, diríem, de les conseqüències, de tenir calibrades totes les conseqüències és perillós. Hi ha el cas dels primers, del Jesse Gelsen, que és el primer cas que es va tractar, els metges que van tractar aquest noi, que era un noi que tenia una alteració genètica però que tenia una vida i que la vivia tot lo dignament que podia, va resultar que no s'havia previst que hi hauria una reacció com la que la va haver-hi, el noi va morir i llavors es va aturar tota la teràpia gènica. Va haver-hi una aturada de 10 anys o 15 en les que no es va reprendre fins que la tècnica va millorar. Bàsicament, que era molt clar que la utilització de virus per introduir el gen i la reparació en l'organisme produïa uns efectes que no estaven ben calibrats. Com està ara la teràpia gènica? Realment s'ha tornat a obrir, hi ha hagut alguns experiments que s'han autoritzat, sempre per finalitat terapèutica, però estem en condicions de superar aquests problemes de seguretat?
Absolutely. Gene therapy is completely open again. It took about 12, 15 years. And I write about it. You know, one of the things that I like to write about is I like to write about failure. I like to write about failure a lot because I'm very interested in failure. I'm very interested in the collapse of knowledge. I'm very interested in bias. I'm very interested in when medicine makes terrifying mistakes, because that tells us about the structure of knowledge. Like you pointed out, it reminds us of the nature of aspiration and the perversity, the distortion that comes when you have aspirations, particularly false aspirations. So in Emperor of All Maladies, there is over and over again the story of failure, and then in the gene also over and over again the story of overreach and failure. But you're asking the question, is gene therapy open again for scientific investigation? Absolutely. We're using it ourselves. Our own laboratory is using it. We have found new viruses that are vastly less toxic. We have found more safe mechanisms to deliver genes. Not all of it has been easy. There have been, even during this 10-odd years, there have been seminal failures. There were important cases of children developing cancer as a consequence of gene therapy. Those trials had to be stopped because we learned again from scratch. But absolutely, gene therapy is now open again for human beings. Again, some terminology is helpful because we need to know these words if we want to participate in the next series of conversations about human genomes and manipulation. There are really two kinds of gene therapy. So one kind of gene therapy is when you change the genetic material in your blood cells or in your brain cells, in your lung, in your bones, doesn't matter. Obviously, those genetic changes, whether they're introduced by a virus or whatever it might be, those genetic changes don't get permanently stamped into the human genome. When you have a child, that child will not have, of course, those genetic changes. Sperm and eggs erase because they don't come from blood, they don't come from your brain, they come from an embryonic cell. So in sperm and eggs, that genetic change will be not present, and your child, when it's born, will no longer have this gene. That is called somatic gene therapy, from the word soma, from the body. So in other words, these are things that are made in the body but don't get transmitted. But there's a second kind of gene therapy that we can talk about, and we can now talk about, which is not somatic gene therapy, but gene therapy that affects either embryos or sperm or eggs or sperm or egg producing cells. Obviously, if you make a genetic change in a sperm or an egg cell or a sperm or egg making cell, then that genetic change is permanently stamped into the human genome in perpetuity. The children will be born with that genetic change. Every cell in the child will have that genetic change, and that child's child and grandchild and great-grandchild and great-great-grandchild, etc., ad nauseum, will have that genetic change. This is called germline genetic change. Now, until recently, in the United States and in most parts of the West, there was a strong barrier against germline gene therapy. Somatic gene therapy was acceptable. In fact, we use it. I personally use it in the laboratory. We're doing experiments with it and human experiments with it. Somatic gene therapy was okay because there were some dangers. Jesse Gelsinger's case is a good example. But these dangers were thought to be manageable, and we could understand them and we could circumvent them. Now, 3 months ago, the National Academy of Medicine in the United States wrote an extraordinary document. And in that extraordinary document, it asked the question, should we now, should scientists begin to start doing germline gene therapy? This is a huge question. It's a very, very important question. And most people, including I, had thought that the National Academy would say, no, it's probably too early. But to our surprise, this was a big panel. To my surprise, the National Academy of Sciences actually said, yes, for the first time, we are now permitted to consider doing germline gene therapy in human beings. In other words, permanently amending, permanently changing the human genome. So this is a line in the sand, and I suspect within the next 6 months to 4 years, 5 years, we will cross this line.
De fet, aquest canvi d'aquesta línia no és més que un pas bastant lògic després del diagnòstic preimplantacional, per exemple. Ja s'utilitza la tècnica de descobriment d'anàlisi de l'ADN de l'embrió per exemple, en el cas de la hemofília, seleccionar l'embrió que és home, perquè la dona és la que transmet la malaltia i la pateixen els homes. Per tant, diríem, amb aquesta finalitat terapèutica d'evitar la transmissió d'una malaltia, en el diagnòstic preimplantacional es pot seleccionar el sexe per via de tècniques genètiques, diríem, i per altres vies. També es podria fer en altres plantejaments. El que passa és que afectar les línies germinals requeriria un consens i requeriria un debat social que encara no hem fet. Estem en condicions de fer-lo?
Absolutely. The central message in the gene is that I do not think we're ready. I think to be ready requires not a panel of scientists in white coats and lawyers sitting in Washington, D.C. And saying, tomorrow morning is a new day, we'll cross over the line in the sand. The human genome is, by definition, the most human thing we possess. This is it's like a tautological truth. Manipulating the human genome, changing the human genome, putting a stamp on the human genome is not a casual thing that we can do. It is, in fact, profoundly non-casual. So if we are going to cross this line, even if it is, in fact, the National Academy made some very thoughtful observations. It said that we should cross this line, and interestingly, this book, which came out about 8 months or 9 months before this document, had basically the same. I had made the same recommendations, and it can think of it as a triangle. So the question that was raised is, when should we allow us, scientists, under what constraints, under what circumstances should scientists be now able to make deliberate changes in the human genome in the germline, so that changes are stamped in eggs and so forth for generation after generation. And the National Academy of Sciences, and in fact I, in the book, for people who are interested, it's page 629 in the Catalan version, 620 something in the Spanish version, made 3 recommendations. And they're very important because I'll tell you why. One is that the condition that we're trying to change or affect with gene therapy should be a condition of extraordinary suffering. I'll come back to that idea. The words that I used in the book are extraordinary suffering. It's interesting that the panel also uses the same phrase, extraordinary suffering. So we'll come back to the idea. So don't do this casually. Yeah. Number 2, that we should be allowed to make these changes in the human genome if there's a strong causal relationship between the gene and the outcome. In other words, if you're not 100% sure, you talked about examples when some genes have very small effects, they sometimes don't have a full effect on our bodies, but if there's a very strong effect, if you have Huntington's disease mutation, there's a 100% chance that you will have that disease, and that disease is one of extraordinary suffering, so that qualifies. So that was number 2. In the book, I called it penetrance, the same idea. And number 3, in the book, I call it justifiable freedom, which is to say that there should be no state mandate. it should be up to you if you want to have a child who happens to have whatever genetic inheritance that your child happens to have. It should be okay. And then there should be some, in other words, there should be some justifiability. It should stand to reason. If there's another simple way to achieve the same end, changing the environment, making nourishment better, etc., we should do that before turning to genes. Okay, so that's the triangle. Now, that's the easy part of the equation. The tough part of the equation is, let's take the first word, extraordinary suffering. Who defines extraordinary suffering? You? Me? Are we going to ask people what your definition of extraordinary suffering is? And if you don't participate in this conversation, you don't know the vocabulary, you've relinquished the conversation to those people wearing white coats, the lawyers and the scientists wearing white coats and black coats in the room in Washington, D.C., if you relinquish that, maybe they are the ones who define extraordinary suffering. Then what about you? What about your definition? This is the human genome we're talking about, right? So take this idea also of justifiability and freedom. Freedom according to whom? Under what circumstances? There might be some society in which there is no state mandate. There is no state mandate to do genetic intervention, but the individuals might be doing eugenic genetic interventions anyway. Take the case of China and India, right? In India and China, one of the scariest images in this book is not the image of, some kind of eugenic project. It is a simple picture of a pediatric clinic in China. And if you look closely, and I make people look closely, every single baby is male. Every single baby is male because of genetic gender selection. Okay? So in some parts of India and some parts of China, there are 750 girl babies to 1,000 boy babies. Never in the history of human beings has there been such a distortion in society. So when people say, oh, this is sort of far away, floofy stuff, genetic selection, genetic manipulation, I remind them, human beings, private eugenic aspirations have already distorted society. This is not some far away kind of thing. So again, very, very important points that you have just made, that we are crossing over this line. It's important to recall this moment as we cross over this line. But if you want to participate, you've got to know the language. You've got to know the vocabulary. You've got to know the history. You've got to know the context. You need to know what happened in 1937 in a country not so far away from here. You need to know what happened in India and China when genetic aspirations were privatized. If you don't know that story, you've got to know it. Once you know all of this, then you can participate in the conversation. Yeah. Then you can be one of the people that really wants to have a stake in this conversation.
Clar, el problema és que moltes vegades els avenços mèdics i tecnològics s'incorporen sense debat i s'incorporen moltes vegades sense saber d'on venen. En el llibre hi ha un exemple molt maco, un dels capítols que es dedica a com s'arriba a sintetitzar la insulina humana. És molt maco perquè, clar, es veu quin avenç representa això. És a dir, ara veiem que els malalts de diabetes es curen i poden viure indefinidament gràcies a que hi ha una hormona produïda pel cos humà que hem aconseguit crear-la a partir de la manipulació d'uns bacteris que permeten obtenir aquesta hormona. Molta gent no sap que abans que hi hagués aquesta bactèria recombinant que podia fer la insulina, la hormona s'obtenia de pàncreas triturats de porc i de vaca a raó de 400 grams d'hormona per cada 3.200 quilos de pàncreas. Imagineu-vos la dificultat d'obtenir aquest medicament i el cost que això representava. En aquest moment, la hormona de la insulina és una cosa absolutament, diríem, a l'abast de tothom.
And safe.
I segura, perquè a més és humana, que és com si fos humana. En el llibre m'ha sorprès veure, hi ha també alguns avenços que estan ben acceptats perquè representen simplement un avenç en el coneixement. Tots parlem de l'ovejita d'oli. L'ovejita d'oli no té cap interès per la humanitat perquè això no ens resol ni problemes de nutrició, ni problemes de salut, ni problemes de res, però sí que va resoldre un tema que era fonamental, que és la possibilitat d'obtenir animals transgènics i la clonació, diríem. Aquest mateix equip que va fer l'ovejita d'oli té unes gallines, ha aconseguit produir unes gallines que produeixen ous dels quals se pot obtenir interferó humà, que també és una substància molt difícil d'aconseguir. I aquestes gallines no només produeixen interferó humà, elles, sinó que transmeten la capacitat de produir interferó amb l'ou a la seva descendència. Per tant, quan parlem...
You can have an interferon omelette.
Exacte. Exactament. No, el que és més important és tenir l'interferon per tractament mèdic, que és interessant. Llavors, això ho tenim i ens en beneficiem, encara que molta gent, quan li donen aquest tractament, no sap com s'ha obtingut aquest tractament. Però, clar, manipular l'herència i les condicions i les característiques d'una persona és una altra cosa. Hi ha una dita en ciència que és: tot allò que es pot fer i que és útil, tard o d'hora s'acaba fent. Per tant, si tard o d'hora s'acaba fent perquè és útil, és pràcticament segur que més val que ens hi posem a discutir-ho ja, perquè probablement aquest dilema el tindrem ben ràpidament. La capacitat de triar característiques específiques. De moment, aquest document de l'Acadèmia de Ciències és un document que limita encara la possibilitat d'intervenció per raons terapèutiques. Però això pot canviar en la sensibilitat. I de la mateixa manera que a la Xina i a la Índia ningú pregunta per què es pot fer eugenèsia, en aquest cas de gènere, probablement la societat, si veu que té una utilitat, potser ho acceptarà. No estem entrant en un terreny molt perillós? Es pot arribar a desenvolupar teories eugenèsiques de nou gràcies a aquests nous descobriments, perquè una diferència és veritat. En el capítol dedicat a l'eugenèsia de la primera meitat del segle XX, la diferència fonamental era que era una eugenèsia involuntària, el cas de la Carrie o els casos d'Alemanya. Era una eugenèsia que es decidia per part del poder i s'aplicava. Però, clar, comencem justificant d'alguna manera en la millora per evitar una malaltia, però la frontera en aconseguir una millora simplement per ser millors com a espècie és molt lleugera. I aquí gent com Michael Sandel, per exemple, és un especialista en bioètica, que diu: si traiem l'atzar de la nostra vida i pensem que podem triar com seran els nostres fills, l'amor incondicional que tenim pels fills, que en aquests moments és la força més poderosa que protegeix l'espècie, el fet que els pares acceptin els seus fills tal com són, queda destruït. I si podem triar el fill, la relació entre els pares i els fills i la relació amb l'atzar també canviarà. Crec que és una qüestió que la tenim a tocar de les...
Yes, so I mean, Sandel's essay is an important essay for exactly that reason. In fact, what's interesting to me in reading Sandel's essay is not... So this essay is also written around the same time, maybe 3-4 years ago.
Sí.
Asks the
Contra la perfecció.
Exactly. The quest for perfection, the desire for perfection, on perfection. Ask the question that you're asking. But one of the things that's interesting to me about Sandel's essay is that not only is he saying that our the things that keep our species together in a kind of purposeful way will change. He's saying the definition of human will change. We will no longer be the same human that we were before we started doing all of this. And of course, this is true. Technology is constantly changing the definition of what human is. Most of people won't notice this, but to a human being living 500 years ago, we've already become androids, partly fused with our phone. So the definition of human is changing, but there is something special about the definition of of a human being that changes once we start manipulating the human genome. But before we sort of get, on the other hand, carried away, I also want to remind people of two things. Number one is that there is a voice which is saying, and you raised this early on, there's a voice in science, a thoughtful voice saying that there will be sharp biological constraints to our ability to be able to do this. Most human traits are so complicated, so polygenic, so many genes with small effect that we'll end up really being biologically constrained. This is not going to be a free-for-all. You can't go to the kind of supermarket and say blue eyes, blonde hair, 6'2", whatever your predilections. No myopia, no hypermetropia, no balding, no God knows what. I would be eliminated for half of those reasons. Most people in science think that scientists, human geneticists, think that that's a very unlikely possibility to happen in the near future. I'm not so sure. 10 years ago, we were saying it was very unlikely that we'd ever be able to make such changes in the human genome. So, the second piece, there can be some biological constraints that will naturally keep a limit. And the second thing that's important to remember is that there's a profound amount of good that has come out of this. Insulin, interferons, the capacity potentially of changing, I learned a surprising fact. I learned that mosquitoes have no other purpose in the world except to be human pests. That's the only purpose of a mosquito. It doesn't have apparently I'm told, I'm not an ecologist, apparently I'm told it has no ecological purpose. It doesn't pollinate a particular tree. It is not necessary in a particular food chain. In fact, the only purpose is, whoever created the mosquito, if God created the mosquito, it was only to make humans suffer. So the capacity to use these technologies to eliminate mosquitoes. Hundreds of millions of people die of mosquito-borne illnesses. In fact, there's an experiment going on right now. We'll start in various places, but has already been done to try to genetically manipulate mosquitoes to basically create, when they mate with each other, or when either they can't carry malaria or really carry Plasmodium, or when they mate with each other, they actually kill. They create sterile offspring. Or other versions of this, so-called gene drive. I'm not going to explain the complexities of all of this. So potentially profound things could come out of this. You talked about interferon, insulin, the capacity to alleviate human diseases, the possibility that you could eliminate BRCA1, the breast cancer-causing gene, from a family's history afflicted by breast cancer, the capacity to diagnose cancer early, at its earliest stages. I'm an oncologist. This is the kind of dream that we live for. But on the other hand, comes with it all of this this kind of nest of ethical questions.
Però la diversitat, en termes filosòfics, la diversitat és interessant, sempre ho hem pensat, no? La diversitat és la que ens enriqueix, la que fa que assolim noves fites, que sumem coses diverses, construïm coses noves. Però és que, a més, també des del punt de vista de l'evolució, la diversitat té una funció. Si avui fóssim capaços d'intervenir sobre el genoma completament i poguéssim triar quines són les característiques que volem que a partir d'ara el genoma humà transmete a la descendència, eliminaríem de cop la diversitat i, per tant, eliminaríem la principal regla de la supervivència, que és precisament tenir normes de diversitat que ens permetin adaptar a les situacions canviants de l'entorn. Seria una follia, no?, plantejar-s'ho, inclús en termes de les regles de l'evolució.
Yeah, absolutely. And, evolution, as you know, evolution loves monsters. It is the principle, is the engine that drives evolution. And again, it's a question that we all have to ask ourselves, is if we really opened up this black box, would we homogenize, and to what extent would we homogenize ourselves and our cultures? Another name for variability by another name could be illness. What's your variation, your genetic variation could be my definition of illness. Is being deaf genetic variation, or is it being ill? Is having short stature genetic variation, or is it being ill? 5'3" Is that ill or is it genetic variation? Where's that line? Who is going to draw this line? It's the same kind of line between what is extraordinary suffering and what's not extraordinary suffering. Another complicated line. Where does illness begin? Where does normalcy end? Is it, human features generally tend to lie in so-called Gaussian curves, although not all features are like that. Sexual anatomy is not a Gaussian curve. One example in which genes are very powerfully dichotomous. But many human features lie in Gaussian curves, shapes of noses, colors of skin, etc. Where does one draw that line then? And if we begin to collapse towards homogeneity, you're absolutely right. It's not clear that what human beings are saying now, in one way, philosophically speaking, what human beings are saying now is that we can do better than evolution. We can take the reins of evolution and we can do better. Evolution can be cruel. Nature is cruel. It is brute. It is random, and it is unpleasant. Why don't we make it better? There's a quote by Jim Watson in the end of the book, and he says, "Human beings can do better." I haven't even told you one last piece.
I pitjor també.
Say again?
I pitjor també.
Well, that's exactly right. We've done worse.
Hem tirat bombes atòmiques.
That's exactly right. And absolutely right. Which is why this is a conversation this is why this conversation needs to be had in places like this, not in a small closed room with closed windows and closed doors in a scientist's laboratory in Washington or wherever it might be, in Madrid or Barcelona. It needs to be a public discussion because we can do worse, and we have done worse before. We've done worse serially. We're serial offenders on nature.
Un dels capítols més interessants és el que fa referència a la genètica de poblacions amb els treballs de Luca Cavalli Sforza sobre tot aquest tresor de les cèl·lules mitocondrials i de l'herència que ve a través de les cèl·lules mitocondrials, que per contra del que estaven dient ara, de la diversitat, el que demostra aquests treballs de genètica poblacional és que no hi ha tantes diferències com l'aparença externa sembla entre els diferents humans, entre un bosquimà d'Àfrica i un esquimal, i que hi ha més diversitat en els propis ximpanzés que entre els humans, malgrat que el racisme pretén que hi ha moltes diferències i substancials entre els éssers humans. Aquest treball, aquest capítol, que li dedica tot un capítol a aquesta qüestió...
Chimpanzees think that there are more differences than humans.
Sí, sí.
That's a nice thing.
Clar, perquè entre ells es veuen. Bé, el tema... Amb els treballs de Cavalli Sforza es desterra per sempre la utilització de la genètica amb finalitats racistes?
I should hope so. I mean, one thing that I say that in the book I say 19th century eugenics opened the genie of the gene from the genie of racism from the bottle. 20th century genetics has stuffed it back into the bottle. This is a very good thing because one of the things that we've learned from 20th century genetics, 20th century genomics is that, as you're just pointing out, human beings are actually genetically much more close than we had anticipated, or some people had anticipated. Part of the reason is that we're very young as a species. We are barely 250,000, 300,000 years old. It's a tick-tock in evolutionary time. If you created if someone said to me, if you created a history of evolutionary time, human beings would occupy such a small moment in organismal evolution that you would have to use a microscope to look for the birth of human beings to track that moment. Now, it's very important to be, if you want to blunt the Victorian racism, the Victorian concept of the race, you have to be very accurate with words. Because human beings, also Homo sapiens, evolved geographically and migrated geographically. We know that the migration most likely happened from somewhere in Africa, and it moved northwards and then moved in sort of two waves, one towards Europe, one towards Asia, India, China, Japan, etc., etc. So if you were to look for particular genetic variations, understandably, you will find genetic variations that cluster with those geographic dispersals. In other words, it is absolutely true that a gene, the genes, not one gene, but the genes that produce blue eyes, you won't find those gene variants in the Japanese population. So if by that, if we refer to the idea that certain populations based on the patterns of geographic dispersal have certain gene variants that have been conserved or not, yes, human beings are diverse. The concept of diversity has been reinforced by modern genomics. On the other hand, if you look overall in the genome, the distance, the genetic distance of two men, one from Nigeria and one from Ethiopia, is greater than the genetic distance between a man from Ethiopia who was called black based on the Victorian understanding of races, and someone from Yemen, which is nearby, who would be called white based on the Victorian version of. So in that sense, in a much more global sense, the old idea of race has really been debunked. The story has ended. There is no story anymore. If anything, the genome has provided us with a vast plea for equality. The genome has told us that we are young, we are more equal than we had thought before, and in fact, the Victorian idea, the anthropological idea of races, can only be useful to us in terms of the geographic dispersal of humans. And that's the end of the story, really.
En canvi, hi ha alguns elements, per exemple, de la identitat sexual, que sí que han donat molta feina als genetistes i fins i tot s'ha buscat el gen de l'homosexualitat, no? Perquè hi ha algunes característiques, algunes diferències entre els humans que, per raons culturals, probablement, han preocupat més que d'altres i han donat peu a aquestes investigacions. El llibre també dedica un capítol sencer a les investigacions sobre l'homosexualitat i no s'ha trobat el gen de l'homosexualitat. Tan important és trobar el gen de l'homosexualitat?
I don't think it's important. I mean, to me, the following features, and it goes back to an earlier discussion. If you look at twin studies, if you look at inheritance patterns, it's very evident that there is a genetic component to sexual orientation. I don't know what the heritability estimates are right now, but there is a clear heritable pattern there, and there's a strong suggestion that genes play a powerful influence on sexual orientation. I think that within the community of geneticists, within the community of people who study sexual orientation, there's no doubt. However, we also know that there are likely many genes. Again, it's the same pattern repeats itself, that there are many genes. We have not found what those genes are. Again, we have go back to that moment in which trying to ascribe meaning to this encyclopedia. We don't know what they are. And in fact, it might turn out that there might be surprises. There might be surprising features. I suspect that with modern techniques, if we looked, we will find them. If they exist, if the signal really exists, and if there's a powerful enough heritable component, we will find not one, there will be several, maybe with small effect. And the third thing that's true is that there is an environmental influence, or there is an influence of chance. Even though the concordance between twins for sexual orientation can be as high as 0.5 or 0.6, which are big numbers, remember that the flip side of it is that there's a lack of concordance. In other words, they're identical twins who have the same genome who are not sexually oriented in the same way. But if there's a signal, I think there's very little doubt that we will find it. So the question really arises, why this chapter then? Why dedicate a chapter to a phenomenon where we don't have any concrete genes, where we don't have any concrete evidence of what those genes are? And the answer to me is very, very simple. The answer is that chapter is absolutely essential in this book. Because I'm not interested in the genes, I'm not interested in the content, I'm not interested in the code. I'm interested in how the code, what the code means to us as human beings in human societies. What does it mean to search for a gay gene? There is no such thing right now, and more likely there will not be one gene. It's virtually guaranteed there won't be one gene based on the patterns of inheritance. But to me, what's interesting is the structure of knowledge. To me, what's interesting is the politics that accompanies it. To me, what's interesting is how profoundly just the idea changes the nature of conversation, political conversation. You wouldn't realize this. Someone asked me, what were the surprising controversies generated by your book? In India, I could not, when I brought the book out in India, I could not finish one conversation without talking about the political idea of the gay genes, because the media was obsessed with it, because just 3 or 4 months before, there had been a case in the courts criminalizing homosexual behavior. So every conversation was about that. In other places, they said, we don't care. What do we care? Yes, there's a gene. No, there's no gene. What do we care? So the point here is to show that the language of genetics or the language of inheritance, I should say, not just the language of genetics. What is heritable? What is not heritable? What is biological? What is not biological? What is cultural? What is not cultural? Is different cultures, different societies come to that same question in different ways. To me, that itself is interesting. That itself tells you about the structure of knowledge. It tells you that the political valence, I don't know, what is the translation of valence in Spanish? The political valence, the political potency of an idea can be very different from one place to another place. And to me that is interesting.
Una altra, vostè parlava ara d'una característica humana que és crear problemes allà que no estan relacionats amb la natura, però sí amb les nostres preocupacions culturals, etc., no? Els prejudicis, etc. Una de les característiques que tenim com a éssers humans és el gust per l'anticipació, la naturalesa anticipatòria. Necessitem anticipar-nos al que vindrà, perquè pensem que tenim la il·lusió de que si sabem el que vindrà podrem intervenir-hi. De moment, de la genètica, de tot el que en venim parlant fins ara, hem estat anticipant què es podria fer i què no es podria fer. Però la indústria que en aquest moment està traient més diner de l'anticipació genètica és la indústria dels tests de predicció. És a dir, ara t'ofereixen fer-te un test genètic que te diran que vostè té predicció per 30, 40, 50 patologies, condicions, situacions, etc. Alguns d'ells en absolut fiables, perquè te diuen que te diran la predisposició que tens a patir una malaltia que està modulada per 50, 100, 1.000 gens. Vull dir, no sabem. Aquesta indústria s'hauria de posar alguna mena de limitació. Estem actuant bé amb aquest tipus de comerç de la capacitat de predicció. I l'altra qüestió, és veritat que podem predir també, al mateix temps, la predisposició o el risc que tenim de patir una malaltia determinada, el Huntington o el que sigui. De què serveix poder conèixer el risc de patir una malaltia per la qual encara no tenim capacitat de tractament, per exemple? Això també planteja un dilema.
Well, first questions first. I'm not particularly interested or enamored of these genetic prediction technologies. You swab your cheek, you send it away to someone, they tell you, you have a 10% chance in 20 years from now of developing, I don't know what, baldness. Immaterial to me. On the other hand, there's an experiment which could be done, which will be done in our lifetimes, which is a very powerful experiment. That experiment is, I'm just going to cook up some numbers. We could take 10 million human beings and simultaneously create a genetic map of these 10, sequence their genomes, maybe sequence the active part of the genome, so-called exome. It doesn't matter how deep we go or how wide we go, really. And then the same human beings, we create a fate map, just like we've done for flies or worms. We create a map of their fate. What happens to this person prospectively in life? What do they become? Does this woman get ovarian cancer? Does this woman, I don't know, some more complicated feature? Does this woman suffer terrifying anxiety or depression? Does this woman become impulsive? Man become impulsive? Does this man lose his hair? Does this man get cancer? Does this man's sexual orientation become change in time? Or does this man know from age 12, 13, 11 their propensities, their temperament? Create a fate map. And then we could do something else which we couldn't do before, is we could use computational techniques, deep learning techniques, artificial intelligence, other techniques to begin to find patterns, predictive patterns that will tell you how this genome explains this phenome, how this genotype explains this phenotype. If we do this across not one, not two, not 10, 50, 100, hundreds of millions of people, we will begin to capture information, potentially uncomfortable information. We will capture useful information, like what are the genes that predict whether you have breast cancer or not. We will also produce uncomfortable information because all of a sudden we will have a genetic map correlated with the fate map. I suspect that we will do this experiment in our lifetimes. That is a real experiment. You know, sending a cheek swab and getting a 10% risk of something or the other is an immaterial experiment. So you're absolutely, you're pointing to the possibility of a very important experiment that will happen in our lifetime that will be quite life-changing for us if that happens. So if we do that experiment correctly, we might be able to find, if we do it correctly enough, wisely enough, with enough depth and detail, we will find the natural constraints to genetic knowledge. We will find them natural. We will be able to say, you know, in fact, there is no simple way to predict schizophrenia. Or we might find, in fact, that there are 10 genes and 10 gene variations, and if you put those 10 genes in the appropriate combination, your risk for schizophrenia increases by tenfold. In fact, for schizophrenia, we've already begun to find it's no longer true that we don't have genes. There's already 1 to maybe 3 genes that are gene variants which increase the risk 10, 15, 20, 30, 40%. Not huge numbers, not tenfold, not 50-fold. But again, small numbers that maybe all could add up together to lead to the final story. So that's I think, the more critical and more important experiment, and then we were about to do that. Now, what was your second question? The nice thing is that once I start talking, I forget questions. The second question had to do with what, remind me?
Sí, la qüestió de que quan tenim totes aquestes tecnologies es plantegem un tipus de problemes que no...
What if you have no treatments? Yes, exactly.
Yes.
But in fact, you could say for Huntington's disease, we do have a treatment. So it's not a kind of macabre treatment.
Una de les poques.
Yeah, you could not... Well, you could choose not to have that child. You could screen embryos, and you could choose not to carry that child.
Però en el cas, per exemple, del càncer de mama hereditari, hem vist el cas de l'Angelina Jolie, no? Efectivament, conèixer és molt important perquè pots prendre mesures, encara que les mesures siguin una mastectomia bilateral i una extirpació dels ovaris, que és la manera d'erradicar completament el risc. Però clar, si això, que ara és per un tipus de càncer, el dia que sapiguem que, per exemple, el risc que podem tenir per als càncers més freqüents, però no hi ha tractament, potser que ens angoixarem massa, no? Potser podem triar no saber.
And in fact, in my case, with schizophrenia, I decided not to know. In fact, when the first studies started coming out with these genes that increase risk, the question, you know, I sequence genes all the time. I could send a cheek swab from my own lab, and I could spit into a test tube and put my name, anonymous, SM, and 10 days later, boom, would come back the information of my own. I could open my computer, open a computer file. I do this for my patients all the time, and it would be my whole genome sequenced, giving me all the relevant genetic variation. I could scan down to a gene, one particular gene. It's a little bit more complicated than that I'm describing, because these genes, the genetic variation in schizophrenia that cause some variants of schizophrenia are not so clear. It's actually a little bit more complicated. But nonetheless, in principle, if I tried hard enough, I would be able to do it. But then comes this question which you're asking, which is an incredibly important question, which is, the other day I had a woman who had the BRCA1 gene mutation. Her mother and her grandmother had both died of breast cancer. She had had a bilateral mastectomy to decrease the risk of breast cancer, and she had decided to sequence her own genome for BRCA1, this gene mutation, and her 2 daughters. So I have 2 daughters. So her 2 daughters, and by chance, one of them carried the mutation, the other one did not. These 2 young women have not developed breasts. They are pre-adolescent. And yet, for one woman, her life is completely changed now, right? For this mother, her relationship with that daughter is fundamentally changed compared to the relationship with the other daughter. Well, on the other hand, this daughter will undergo interventional screening. She might decide to have a mastectomy. She might decide to do, and maybe that will save her life. So here again is the question of balancing the risks, the possibility of screening versus the possibility of inhabiting a surveillance society, a society in which you're constantly surveying yourself for future potential risk. Imagine now, not just for breast cancer, imagine for other disease. Imagine we did this over and over again across multiple diseases. Would you want to live in that society? Does anyone here? Who wants to inhabit, do you want to, let's say we started doing this as a routine. Raise your hands, you want to be a part of the but remember, this might lead to cures. Most people think we're treating Alzheimer's disease. That's why many of these medicines don't work. We're treating too late. Cancer, we're treating too late. Neurodegenerative disease, if we could only shift the clock, maybe some of the medicines would start working. Maybe we can invent new medicines. So the possibility exists of being really able to change the paradigm for medical treatment. But do you want to live in a genetic surveillance society? Raise your hand. You wouldn't mind, yeah, you don't mind, yeah. Some people wouldn't mind. Other people do mind. But what if it comes? What if it arrives? Would you feel the pressure now to participate just because it's come? Like buying an iPhone? I don't know.
Sí, bé, són dilemes importants i hauríem d'anar acabant perquè ja hem exhaurit el temps. El llibre acaba amb 3 grans reptes que té la genètica en aquests moments. Alguns d'ells ja els ha mencionat, però m'agradaria que em fes un resum final i perquè jo crec que aquests 3 reptes defineixen molt bé el punt en el que estem i el següent pas. Després ja discutirem dintre de 10 anys més, quan tregui el següent llibre, i ja discutirem si s'han complert. Aquests 3 punts m'ha semblat que eren molt importants.
So, one of them, one challenge we talked about already, is to ascribe meaning. So how do you take that information across multiple populations, and how do you ascribe meaning? How do you read the genome and ascribe meaning to the genome? And one project that I've talked about is this Million People project. Create a fate map, create a genetic map, and try to crisscross correlate them together. And related to that is the challenge of manipulating the human genome, and how you might be able to not just read, but write. And we talked about that. And to some extent, the third challenge is really a synthesis of the first 2 challenges, which is once we start doing these things together, reading and writing, how much of the human genome can we really understand, and how much of it can we change? These experiments, each of these individual challenges really leads to an experiment. And these experiments are being done right now, whether you like it or not. These experiments are being done, they will be done in our lifetimes. The I talked about the line in the sand. We have already, in the United States, I think we will cross that line within this year. The first attempts at making sperm or egg cells from human beings with permanently altered genetic information will arrive within maybe 1 to 2 years. Whether we create a baby out of that sperm is a question mark. I don't know the answer. At that point of time, laws, you, me, this conversation will start kicking in, saying you've got to stop. We've shown that the proof of principle exists. You've shown that it can be done. Now stop. And we've done this before, certainly. But we've also, as you pointed out very, very importantly, we've also crossed those lines and made terrible mistakes. The idea that you can try to mine or understand the information in the human genome, try to figure out what the natural constraints are and what information can be obtained backward, that's also going to be done. We will very soon, in fact, we're in the middle of doing that. I'm actually involved with it a little bit. I'm following, actually, next, in 2 weeks, I will meet the first patient. Funny word. In fact, it's not a patient, right? Because it's a person with no, it's a normal human being. So I will meet the first patient, normal, I don't know what to say. I will meet the first person who will be part of the study, patient 0. It's not patient, sorry, it's person 0 of this study. And he or she will have their genetic gene sequenced and start creating a kind of fate map of them. And then, of course, mixing and matching these things together to make human beings that are no longer constrained by our past or evolution or nature.
En el llibre es veu molt clar que els grans avenços de la genètica s'han produït coincidint en grans moments d'avenços també tecnològics que permeten la investigació i l'observació. Llavors, quan se descobreixen aquestes noves tècniques, llavors la genètica dona un salt. En els últims 10 anys s'han produït alguns d'aquests canvis tan importants i, per tant, és de preveure, com molt bé es veu en el llibre, que hi haurà un salt important també en els propers anys. Esperem que Siddhartha Mukherjee torni aquí a explicar-nos les conseqüències d'aquest canvi, que ens torni a fer un llibre per anar actualitzant.
I told you, I will be eliminated. I'm part of the yesterday defective crew.
No.
I'll be wiping the windows, but someone else will be here telling us about how human beings are going forward into the future. I'll be wiping the windows on the other side.
Esperem que la seva faceta d'investigador no li impedeixi l'extraordinària faceta de divulgador científic. Tenim molta necessitat de persones que expliquin la ciència des de dins i l'expliquin de manera entenedora per poder justament permetre aquests debats sobre coses tan importants pel nostre futur i per l'esdevenir de la humanitat. Per tant, jo només acabo donant-li les gràcies per la immensa feina feta, recomanar el llibre, els asseguro que es llegeix d'una manera absolutament fascinant i, per tant, gràcies per estar aquí i per la seva feina. Gràcies.